Travis had a word for people like Walter. He used it in meetings, in performance reviews, in casual conversations with the younger staff who laughed when he said it. The word was legacy, as in legacy thinking, legacy approach, legacy employee, as in the past, the outdated, the finished. He said it like a joke, and everyone laughed, including people who had worked with Walter for years. What Travis didn't know, what he had never once stopped moving fast enough to find out, was what Walter had been doing for 32 years. And when the competitor hired Walter 6 weeks after Travis let him go, Travis discovered something that kept him awake for a very long time. Some things don't get old. They get valuable. Hi, I'm Luna, and this is Poppy. Today's story is about a man the world decided was finished, a man who had spent 32 years becoming extraordinary at something, and who worked every day beside people who were too busy moving fast to notice. This is a story about what experience actually looks like, and about what happens when the people who dismissed it finally understand what they lost. Stay with us. If you've ever been made to feel that your experience was a liability instead of an asset, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Walter Okafor had worked at Meridian Solutions for 32 years. He was 12 people in a converted warehouse on the south side of the city. He had been there through 4 different CEOs, 3 office relocations, 2 near bankruptcies, and 1 acquisition attempt that he had personally helped to fend off by producing documentation that nobody else in the company knew existed. He was 61 years old. He had silver hair that he kept short and a face that showed its years without apology. He wore the same style of clothes he had always worn, neat, unremarkable, functional. He arrived at 7:30 every morning and left at 5:30 every evening and in. Between those hours, he produced work of a quality and consistency that had kept 3 major client relationships intact through situations that would have ended most partnerships. Nobody in the current office knew this. Most of the current staff had not been working when those situations occurred. Travis certainly hadn't been. Walter's desk was in the corner of the main floor, the corner that got the least natural light, that was furthest from the coffee station, that nobody walked past unless they specifically needed to. He had been moved there 2 years earlier, when the office had been redesigned to reflect the company's new direction. The new direction, as Travis had described it at the all-hands meeting, was forward-facing, agile, and youth-driven. Walter had listened to this description. He had nodded once. He had gone back to his desk in the corner and continued the work he had been doing before the meeting. He had seen 4 company directions in 32 years. He had outlasted 3 of them. He had quietly fixed the problems that each new direction introduced without being asked and without making a point of it. It was simply what he did. He had a method for everything, not because he was rigid, but because he had learned across 3 decades that reliable processes produced reliable results, and that reliability, in the service of other people's businesses, was more valuable than it looked. He kept records. Not obsessively, but carefully, the kind of documentation that allowed him, at any point, to reconstruct the reasoning behind a decision made 18 months earlier. He had found, more than once, that this documentation was the thing that saved a client relationship when a dispute arose about what had been agreed and when. The younger staff had, at various points, asked him why he kept such detailed notes. He had said, because memory is unreliable and contracts are incomplete, and the gap between those 2 things is where most problems live. Some of them had written that down. Most of them had nodded and moved on to the next thing. Walter had not minded. He had been saying versions of that sentence for 20 years. The ones who needed it would remember it eventually, usually when they needed it. His daughter, Addis, called him every Sunday evening. She was 33, a pediatric nurse, and had her father's particular quality of focused attention, the ability to be completely present with whatever was in front of her. She called him stubborn. He called it consistent. She said those were the same thing. He said they weren't, and he could explain why, but the explanation was long. She always said, "Go ahead, Dad, I have time." He had never told her about the difficulties at work. He did not bring work home in that sense. But she knew him well enough to hear something in his voice on the Sundays when things had been particularly pointed. She would say, "Are you okay?" He would say, "I'm fine. How are the kids on your ward?" And she would tell him, and he would listen. And by the end of the call, he usually was fine. Travis Cole had been appointed Managing Director of Meridian Solutions 14 months ago. He was 34 years old, had an MBA from a well-regarded university, and had spent the previous 6 years at a larger firm where he had learned, among other things, that the most important thing in any organization was momentum. Momentum meant movement. Movement meant change. Change meant getting rid of what was slowing you down. He had identified Walter as something that was slowing them down approximately 3 weeks after joining the company. Not from any specific failure. Walter had not failed at anything, but he moved at a pace that Travis found uncomfortable, deliberate, careful, thorough. He asked questions in meetings that Travis considered beside the point. He flagged risks that Travis considered hypothetical. At one team meeting, a strategy session for a new client pitch, Walter had raised a concern about the timeline. He had said carefully, "We've had this kind of compressed timeline before on the Pemberton account. It created problems we spent 6 months fixing. I'd recommend we build in 2 additional review cycles." Travis had looked at him for a moment. Then he had said, "We don't do things that way anymore, Walter." That approach is outdated. A few people around the table had laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, most of them, but enough. Walter had looked at the table. He had said, "All right." He had written 1 line in his notebook. He had not said anything else. The Pemberton-style problem arrived 4 months later on exactly the account Walter had flagged. The cleanup took 7 months. Travis had described it in the all hands as a learning experience. Walter had not said, "I told you so." He had fixed it, without being asked, without making a point of it. He produced documentation that Travis considered excessive. Travis had a phrase for this too, analysis paralysis. He used it in the same tone he used legacy as a diagnosis, not a description. The younger illustrious always pick up on their manager's pick up on their manager's attitudes quickly, thoroughly, and without anyone needing to say it directly. There had been a moment in month 7 that Walter had not forgotten, a Friday afternoon. The team gathered near the coffee station. Travis had been talking about a new process initiative and had referenced in passing the way things used to be done. He had said, "The old way, the legacy approach," and he had glanced, briefly and deliberately, in the direction of Walter's corner. 3 people had followed his gaze. 2 of them had smiled. 1 had laughed, a short, quiet laugh, the kind you make when you want to signal that you understand the joke without making too much of it. Walter had been looking at his screen. He had not turned around. He had heard everything. They had stopped including Walter in the informal conversations. They had stopped asking him questions in meetings, even when his answers were useful. They had started, gradually and without apparent coordination, treating his corner of the office as a different zone entirely. Walter had noticed. He had not commented on it. He had continued doing his work. Travis had called Walter into his office for the first time in month 4. He had spoken about the company's direction, about agility, about the importance of keeping pace with a rapidly evolving industry. He had said, with the specific phrasing of someone who has rehearsed a version of this conversation, "I want to make sure we have the right people in the right roles. Do you feel like this environment is still working for you?" Walter had looked at him. He had said, "Yes." "Is it working for you?" Travis had blinked. The conversation had not gone where he intended. He had said something about keeping the lines of communication open, and Walter had said that was fine and had gone back to his desk. Travis had decided from that point to be more direct. He was going to manage Walter out. He simply needed to find the right way to do it. The performance review happened in month 11. Travis had prepared for it carefully. He had gathered what he considered evidence by response times on emails that were slower than average. Participation metrics from team meetings that showed Walter speaking less frequently than his colleagues. A project timeline where Walter's section had been completed precisely on schedule, but not ahead of it. He had built a case for what he was calling underperformance. Walter had sat across the desk and listened to the case being made. He had not interrupted. When Travis finished, he had said, "Can I show you something?" He had placed a single folder on the desk. Inside it, 3 client retention entailses, going back 7 years. The documentation of each crisis that had threatened the company's major accounts and what had been done to resolve them. The timestamps on the documents showed clearly who had identified the problems, who had developed the solutions, and when. Walter said, the Hartley account, the Pemberton account, the Norkel Group. These are the 3 clients that represent 62% of our current revenue. Each of them nearly walked in the past 7 years. Each of them stayed because of work done in this folder. Travis looked at the folder. He looked at Walter. He said, "That's historical. We need to talk about current performance." Walter said, "The historical is what makes the current possible. Would you like me to explain how?" Travis said he appreciated the context, but the conversation needed to focus on measurable outputs going forward. Walter collected his folder. He said, "All right." He stood up. He went back to his desk. That evening, he had done something he rarely did. He had taken his work notebook home, the physical one, the one he had been keeping for the past 2 years, and sat at his kitchen table and read through it. Page after page of observations. Patterns in client behavior. Risks flagged. Solutions proposed, some accepted and some not. The record of 32 years compressed into the most recent 2, the years when the atmosphere had changed. When the corner had become his. When the word legacy had entered the air. He read it for an hour. Then he closed it. Then he made himself a cup of tea and sat with it by the window. He was not angry. He had moved past anger somewhere near bankruptcy when he had understood that had nothing to do with their actual value out and hot. Hot anger burned hot. Anger somewhere. What he had instead was clarity, a clear understanding of what was happening and what he was going to do about it. He was not going to fight it. He was working on hand it over properly and leave. Hand it over properly and leave. And then he was going to find somewhere that understood what it had. He had known, walking out of that office, that it was over. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because the person across that desk had already made a decision. And Walter had been around long enough to recognize the decision that had already been made. He called his daughter that Sunday. She said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I think I'm going to be looking for a new position soon." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, they have no idea what they have." He said, "I know, but that's their problem, not mine." If you've ever watched someone be dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual value, leave a like on this story. Because Walter deserves to be seen. And so does every person like him. Travis had called it a restructuring. The official language was position elimination as part of a strategic realignment. Walter's role had been declared redundant, which required a different legal process than termination and involved a settlement that Travis's HR director had handled with a particular efficiency of someone doing something they considered routine. Walter had signed the paperwork. Before he left Travis's office that day, Travis had said one more thing. He had said it with the particular lightness of a man who has decided something is finished. "Look, you've had a good run, 32 years is impressive, but the industry has changed. The skill set has changed. Sometimes the kindest thing is to acknowledge that and move forward. The kindest thing. Walter had looked at him. He had thought about the folder on the desk, about the 3 client retention analysis, about 62%. He had said, "Thank you for your time, Travis." He had stood up. He had left. He had been given 4 weeks' notice, which he had served quietly and without incident. On his last day, he arrived at 7:30, as always. He cleared his desk methodically, not quickly, not with drama, simply in the way of someone who has decided how they are going to do a thing and is doing it that way. He had a box. He had not brought a large box because he did not have many personal items at the office. He had always considered the office a place to work, not a place to inhabit. A few colleagues stopped by, Maria from accounts, who had been at the company for 11 years, and who shook his hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. James from the technical team, who said, "This is wrong. I want you to know I think this is wrong." Walter had said, "I appreciate that. Keep doing good work." Travis did not come out of his office. Walter had not expected it. He carried his box to the elevator. The office had gone quiet around him in the particular way offices go quiet when something significant is happening that nobody is acknowledging. 2 people near the door had seen him with the box and looked away quickly. A third had watched him the entire way across the floor with the expression of someone who knows they should say something and cannot find the words. Walter had not looked back, not because he was making a point, because there was nothing left in that direction that required his attention. Everything he needed were everything that mattered was already in his head. And what was in his head, what 32 years of careful, almost difficult work had put there, was going with him wherever he went next. He pressed the button. He waited. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. The doors closed. He had spent 32 years building something in that building. He was leaving with a box that weighed less than 5 pounds. Everything that actually mattered, everything he had built, was still in his head. Nobody had thought to ask for it back. Walter had not been planning to look for another position. At 61, after 32 years at one company, the conventional wisdom, the kind dispensed by well-meaning people who had never been in his situation, was that the market would be difficult, that his age would work against him, that he should consider what retirement might look like. Walter had considered what retirement might look like. It had looked like a conversation he was not ready to have with himself yet. So he had done what he had always done when faced with a problem. He had thought about it carefully. He had gathered information. He had made a list. The list was of companies in his sector that were facing challenges he recognized. He knew this sector the way you know something after 32 years of close. Attention, not just its current state, but its patterns, its recurring failures. The specific places where organizations tended to make the same mistakes in slightly different forms. One name was on the list before he had finished writing it: Apex Consulting. Meridian's most significant competitor. A company that had been growing for 3 years and was beginning to show the particular strain that rapid growth produces client relationships becoming transactional. Institutional knowledge being lost as founding staff moved on. The gap between what they promised and what they delivered beginning to widen. Walter recognized these signs. He had watched them develop at Meridian in the years before each of the 3 major crises. He had fixed those crises at Meridian. He could see, with the clarity of someone who knows exactly what they are looking at, that Apex was building toward the same kind of moment. He had reached out to Apex's CEO, a woman named Sandra Reeve, whose reputation he had followed for several years through a mutual contact. He had requested 30 minutes. He had been given an hour. In that hour, he had described, with specific evidence and precise language, the pattern he was seeing in Apex's client retention data that was publicly available if you knew where to look and how to read it. He had described, with equal precision, what he believed needed to happen before the pattern became a crisis. Sandra Reeve had listened without interrupting. When he finished, she had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "How long have you been watching us?" Walter said, "Long enough to know you're about 8 months from a problem you don't want to have." She had said, "When can you start?" He had started on a Monday. He had driven to the Apex offices, a 15-minute drive from his house, a detail he had noted without particular emotion, and he had arrived at 7:30. Sandra Reeve had been in early. She had come out to meet him in the lobby, not sent someone, come herself, and had shaken his hand and said, "I want you to know that we understand what we're getting, and we intend to use it properly." Walter had said, "That's all I've ever asked." He had meant it completely. That was the thing that people like Travis had never understood. Walter had never needed recognition or celebration or the corner office. He had needed to be useful. Genuinely, substantively useful in a way that the organization understood and valued. Apex gave him that. From the first week, Sandra had included him in the conversations that mattered. She had asked questions and listened to the answers and followed up and asked more questions. She had treated his experience as the resource it was, not as a curiosity, not as a legacy, but as something the organization needed and intended to use. Walter had worked harder in his first 6 months at Apex than he had in his last 3 years at Meridian. Not because the work was harder, because it mattered again. Walter joined Apex Consulting 8 weeks after leaving Meridian. His title was Senior Client Strategy Advisor, a role that Sandra Reeve had created specifically for him, built around what she had described in his contract as institutional knowledge and pattern recognition. He had arrived on his first morning at 7:30. His new desk was near the window. He had noted this without comment and sat down and begun to work. The work at Apex was familiar in its fundamentals and different in its details to another in the same sector, the way all work is when you move from one organization to another in the same sector. Walter had always found this transition interesting rather than difficult, right? He was a person who paid attention, and new environments gave him new things to pay attention to. Within 6 weeks, he had identified 3 client relationships that were at risk. Within 8 months, he had done something that nobody at Apex had expected. One of the 3 clients he had stabilized was a company called Hargrove Industries. Hargrove had been a Meridian client for 11 years before switching to Apex the previous year. The switch had been contentious. Meridian had not handled the transition well, and the relationship had ended badly. Walter knew Hargrove. He had worked with their account team at Meridian for 6 of those 11 years. He knew the history of the relationship, the particular concerns of their leadership, the specific way their organization communicated when something was wrong. When he had reached out to Hargrove's operations director, a man named Graham Cole, who had dealt with Walter at Meridian and who had initially been surprised to hear from him at Apex, the conversation had been direct and productive. Walter had said, "I know why the last relationship ended badly. I'd like to make sure this one doesn't." Graham had said, "Tell me what you have in mind." The Hargrove account became, within a year, Apex's largest. It was also the account that Travis Cole, no relation to Graham, had been trying to win back from Meridian since the switch. He had not succeeded. He would not succeed. Because the person who knew Hargrove well enough to rebuild that relationship was no longer at Meridian. He was at the company across the street. Travis found out in stages. The first stage was the quarterly numbers, which showed that Apex had been growing its market share in exactly the sectors where Meridian had been strongest. He had attributive sales. He had attributed this to competitive pricing and aggressive sales. The second stage was a conversation with Maria from accounts. The second stage was an Apex now and had been involved in the Hargrove account. Travis had said that was interesting. He had said it in the tone he used when something was not interesting to him but was inconvenient. The third stage was a call from Graham at Hargrove, who had phoned to officially confirm that Hargrove would not be returning to Meridian, and who had said, with the specific directness of a man who has decided to be honest, "I'll tell you why, Travis. When Walter was here, we always felt like someone understood us, understood our history, our concerns, what mattered to us. When he left, that went with him. And when we found out he was at Apex, well, that's where we needed to be." Travis had said he appreciated the feedback. He had ended the call. He had sat in his office for a while. He had thought about the performance review, about Legans since the switch. He had not in his office reviews on it, the 3 client retention intentions analyses, the timestamps, the documentation. He had thought about the question Walter had asked him at the end of that first conversation in month 4. "Is it working for you?" Travis was 34 years old and had an MBA and had been moving fast his entire career. He had never once considered that speed and knowledge were not the same thing. He was considering it now. Travis called Walter on a Thursday afternoon in October. Walter was in a meeting when the call came in. He saw the name on the screen. He let it go to voicemail. He listened to the voicemail that evening in his car in the Apex parking lot before driving home. Travis had said, "Walter, it's Travis. I'd like to talk, if you're open to it." He had left his number. He had said, "Take your time." Walter had sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. He had thought about 32 years, about the corner desk, about the word legacy used as a verdict, about the box that had weighed less than 5 pounds. He had also thought about something his father had told him when he was very young. His father had said, "The people who wrong you are not always the people who will wrong you forever. Sometimes they learn, and what you do with that learning says something about you, not them." Walter called Travis back the following morning. They met for coffee 2 weeks later. Travis had arrived first. Walter had noticed this. Travis had said, without preamble, "I made a mistake. I didn't understand what you brought to the company. I categorized you incorrectly, and I acted on that categorization without looking closely enough at the evidence. The folder you put on my desk in the review, I dismissed it. I shouldn't have." He paused. He said, "I'm not calling to ask you to come back. I don't think that's what's right here, and I think you probably don't either. I'm calling because I wanted to say it directly. What I did was wrong. It cost the company. More than that, it wasn't fair to you." Walter looked at him. He thought, this is a person learning something. He thought, that is not nothing. He said, "I appreciate you saying that," he said. "For what it's worth, the things I flagged in those meetings, the risks I documented, the questions I kept asking, they weren't about slowing things down. They were about not having to clean up the mess later," Travis said. "I understand that now." Walter said, "Good, that's worth something." They finished their coffee. They shook hands. Walter drove back to Apex. Travis drove back to Meridian. They were not friends, but something had been completed, something that needed to be. Walter had been at Apex for 18 months when Sandra Reeve asked him to lead a new initiative. The initiative was a knowledge retention program, a systematic effort to document the institutional knowledge that lived in the heads of APX's longest-serving employees and make it accessible to the organization as a whole. Sandra had said, "We've been watching what happens at companies that grow fast and lose their history. I don't want that to be us. And you're the person who understands this better than anyone." Walter had looked at her. He had said, "You're describing exactly what happened to Meridian." She had said, "I know. That's why I want you running it." The program launched 6 months later. It became, within a year, one of the things Apex was most often cited for in industry conversations. Not a flashy innovation, not a disruptive technology. A system for making sure that what people knew didn't disappear when they left the room. A days had come to the launch. She had stood in the back of the room and watched her father present the framework to 60 colleagues. He had presented it the way he did everything, clearly, specifically, without performance. When it was over, she had found him by the coffee station. She had said, "Dad, they actually see you here." He had looked at his daughter. He had said, "They asked." It was the simplest possible explanation, and it was the one that contained everything. On the drive home that evening, Walter called at A's. It was a Sunday. She picked up before it besennet. Wise on where that I've home that evening. She said, "I know, I was there. The program launched today." She said, "I know, I was there. I watched from the back." He was quiet for a moment, said, "The way you used to look when you'd come home from work and I could tell it had been a good day," he said. "It was a good day," she said. "I'm glad." He thought about Travis, not with bitterness, but with something more considered. He thought, "I hope he learns what I tried to show him in that folder, not for my sake. For the sake of the next person who sits in the corner desk with something important in their head that nobody is asking for." He thought on balance that Travis might learn. The phone call had suggested that possibility, and Walter had always believed in the possibility of people learning. It was one of the few things that 32 years had not changed his mind about. There is a particular kind of arrogance that belongs to speed. It mistakes movement for progress. It mistakes novelty for value. It looks at the person who has been doing it 30 years and sees only they had 30 or years contain. Travis was not a bad person. He was a person who had been rewarded his entire career for moving fast. And he had never been in a situation that cost him enough to make him slow down and look. Until Walter. Walter never argued. He never performed. He never tried to make himself visible in the ways that the new culture valued. He just kept doing the work, the careful, thorough, difficult work of keeping an organization's most important relationships intact. He kept doing it until the day he left, and then he took it with him. Because here's the thing about genuine expertise. It doesn't belong to the company that employs you. It belongs to you. You built it. Across years of attention and effort and mistakes made and corrected, it lives in your head, and it walks out the door with you. So if you are someone who has been doing something carefully for a long time, who has been building real knowledge in the quiet and the unremarkable hours when nobody was watching, don't let anyone call that legacy. Call it what it is. Irreplaceable. If Walter's story stayed with you, if it reminded you that experience is not a liability, it's a foundation, please like this video and subscribe to Poppy Tailies. Leave us a comment. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age or experience? We read every single one. And if you know someone who needs this reminder today, someone whose knowledge is being overlooked, share this story with them, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply keep building. Thank you for being here. I'm Luna. This is Poppy. Until next time.